Kira walked through the ancient forest of silver mist, her boots making soft sounds against the moss-covered ground, and the twin dragons Ash and Ember followed close behind, their scales gleaming in the filtered sunlight that broke through the canopy. Above, and the elf woman carried a leather satchel filled with data crystals, each one containing precious memories of a species the galaxy wanted to forget. 300 years had passed since the last human ship disappeared into the void, and Kira was the only one who still maintained the memorial on Valdris Prime, and every morning she arrived at dawn to clean the monuments, to update the digital archives, to ensure that the stories remained intact, and the other elves thought she was mad, spending centuries honoring ghosts. But Kira had made a promise, and promises meant everything. She remembered the day humans first arrived in their system, and it was during the Great Council meeting when the elven leaders were discussing trade routes with the Centauri merchants, and suddenly the long-range sensors detected multiple ships approaching from the outer rim, and the vessels were primitive by galactic standards, held together with what looked like spare parts and desperation. And when they requested asylum, the council chamber erupted in debate. The humans explained that their sun was dying and Earth would be uninhabitable within 2 centuries, and they needed allies, shelter, and a chance to survive, and most council members voted to deny them. Because why should immortal elves concern themselves with beings who lived barely 100 years? And Kira had abstained from the vote, feeling uncomfortable with the decision, but not brave enough to oppose the majority High Counselor. Theron had shown rare mercy that day, and he granted humans a small settlement zone in the outer territories far from elven cities. And the humans accepted gratefully their leader, President Nicole Gardner, bowing deeply and promising that humanity would prove worthy of this kindness. And Kira remembered thinking how strange it was to see so much hope in creatures who knew they were racing against time. The dragons sensed her troubled thoughts, and Ember nuzzled against her hand while Ash flew ahead to scout the path, and Kira had bonded with them when they were hatchlings 4 centuries ago. And dragons lived even longer than elves, sometimes reaching 5,000 years. And they remembered everything, their minds holding millennia of history. And they were the perfect keepers of memory, which was why Kira had asked for their help with the memorial project. The forest opened into a clearing where an old stone bench sat beneath a flowering crystal tree, and Kira settled onto the bench, pulling out one of the data crystals, and she activated it, watching as a hologram appeared in the air before her, and it showed a young human woman in military uniform. Her dark hair pulled back and her smile confident despite the bandage. On her arm, Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez had been 28 years old when they first met, and Kira had been assigned to evaluate human combat readiness during the early days of the Krill incursion, and the insectoid Krill were expanding aggressively through the sector, consuming worlds and leaving nothing but stripped husks behind, and the Galactic Alliance needed every available soldier, even untested humans. Kira had been skeptical when Amy reported for duty, and the human was small by warrior standards, barely reaching Kira's shoulder, and her equipment looked outdated, and she carried herself with a casualness that seemed inappropriate for military service, and Kira had submitted a report recommending humans be kept in support roles away from actual combat. Then came the mission to Outpost 7, and the Krill had attacked without warning, their swarm ships descending like locusts, and the outpost defenses were overwhelmed in minutes, and Kira found herself trapped in a collapsing bunker with Amy and 3 other soldiers, and the human had taken charge immediately. Her casual demeanor replaced by focused intensity, Amy organized their escape, routing them through maintenance tunnels that Kira hadn't even known existed, and when they encountered a Krill warrior blocking their path, the human didn't hesitate, and she charged forward with nothing but a combat knife and raw determination, and Kira watched in amazement as Amy somehow brought down a creature twice her size using speed and precision that compensated for her lack of strength. They made it to the evacuation ships with seconds to spare, and once they were safe, Kira had asked Amy where she learned to fight like that, and the human laughed and said humans had been fighting each other for thousands of years before they reached the stars, and they knew a thing or two about survival. And that conversation changed Kira's entire perspective. She began spending time with the human colonists, learning their history and their culture, and she discovered that humans created art knowing it would outlast them, and they built monuments to people they never met, and they told stories passed down through generations, and they loved with an intensity that seemed impossible for beings who knew their time was limited. Amy became her closest friend, and they served together for 15 years, fighting the Krill across a dozen worlds. And Kira learned that humans felt fear just like everyone else, but they chose to act anyway. And they understood sacrifice in ways that immortal beings never could, because every choice had weight when you only had one lifetime. The hologram shifted, showing Amy during the liberation of Colony 6, and she was coordinating with Elven forces, directing human pilots through dangerous atmospheric conditions. And Kira remembered that battle, and how Amy had stayed at her post for 40 straight hours, refusing relief because lives depended on her decisions. Ash returned from his scouting mission and landed beside the bench, and the dragon projected images into Kira's mind, showing that the path ahead was clear. And Kira thanked him, storing the data crystal carefully, and she stood stretching her long limbs and continued through the forest toward the memorial complex. The memorial had started small, just a simple stone marker with names of fallen human soldiers, but over the decades it grew, and Kira added gardens with flowers from Earth and walls carved with human poetry and a digital archive containing millions of personal stories, and she funded everything herself, spending her considerable wealth accumulated over 1,000 years of life. Other elves criticized her obsession, and they said she should focus on the present and let the dead rest, and High Counselor Theron had called her before the council twice asking her to cease the project, and he argued that humanity had chosen to leave, and they had departed on their colony ships heading deeper into space, and it was time to move forward. But Kira knew the truth, and she had tracked those colony ships as long as sensors allowed, and the human vessels were barely holding together when they left, and their destination was unknown because they were searching for any habitable world, and the odds of their survival were minimal at best, and Theron knew it too, though he would never admit it. The memorial complex came into view, and it covered 50 acres of carefully maintained land, and the main building was constructed in human architectural style with clean lines and large windows, and inside were exhibits showing human achievements and their art and their history, and holographic displays played footage of human life, from children laughing to couples dancing to soldiers standing guard. Kira walked through the main entrance, and Ember and Ash settled in their usual spots flanking the doorway, and the dragons had become unofficial guardians of this place, and visitors who came to mock or vandalize quickly changed their minds when faced with two fully grown dragons. The archive room was Kira's favorite space, and floor-to-ceiling shelves held data crystals organized by category, and there were military records and personal journals, and video messages and children drawings and wedding photos and everything that remained of humanity's time in this sector. She selected a crystal labeled Rodriguez Family Collection and activated it, and images filled the air showing Amy's parents and her younger brother and her childhood home in the human settlement, and there were birthday parties and school graduations and ordinary moments that somehow felt precious because they represented lives fully lived, despite their brevity. Kira had collected these items after Amy died, and she had visited the human settlement and met Amy's family, and they had welcomed her with warmth despite their grief, and Amy's mother had pressed the family crystal into Kira's hands and asked her to remember, and Kira had promised, and that promise had become her purpose. A sound interrupted her thoughts, and Kira turned to see an elven messenger approaching, and the young elf looked nervous, and he delivered a formal summons from High Counselor Theron, and the council had voted, and the memorial would be demolished in 3 days, and Kira was ordered to remove her personal belongings and cease all resistance. Kira dismissed the messenger without responding, and she looked at the walls covered in human faces and human stories, and she thought about Amy Rodriguez flying into certain death to save a world that wasn't even her own, and she thought about the promise that outlived stars, and she knew what she had to do. The council chamber stood at the heart of Silverspire City, and its crystal walls reflected the morning light in patterns that had witnessed 10,000 years of elven governance, and Kira entered the vast room with Ash and Ember at her sides, and the dragon's presence caused murmurs among the assembled counselors, who considered it highly irregular to bring bonded creatures to official proceedings. High Counselor Theron sat upon the raised platform, and his silver hair cascaded past his shoulders, and his face bore the timeless quality of someone who had lived through 20 centuries, and he regarded Kira with disappointment rather than anger, and he had known her since she was a child, and he remembered when she showed promise as a warrior and a leader, Theron called the session to order, and he addressed Kira formally using her full ceremonial name, and he stated that the council had made its decision regarding the human memorial, and the structure would be demolished, to make way for a new commercial district, and the land could be put to better use serving living citizens, rather than commemorating a departed species. Kira stepped forward, and her voice rang clear through the chamber, and she invoked her right to formal challenge under ancient elven law, and the room fell silent because such challenges were rare and binding, and Theron leaned forward, his expression troubled. The law was older than the current council, and it stated that any elf could challenge a council decision if they believed it violated core elven principles, and, if the challenge was accepted, both sides would present their arguments, and the Elder Circle would judge, and their decision would be final and unchangeable. Theron asked what principle Kira believed was being violated, and she answered without hesitation, and she said the council was breaking the principle of sacred promise, and elven culture had been built on the sanctity of oaths, and throughout history, elves prided themselves on keeping their word even when it became inconvenient, and she had made a promise to Amy Rodriguez, and dismantling the memorial would break that oath. Several counselors objected, and Counselor Mira stood and argued that Kira had made a personal promise, not a council-sanctioned oath, and it did not bind the entire elven people, and besides the humans were gone, and they would never know if the memorial stood or fell. Kira turned to face Mira, and she explained that promises existed independent of witnesses, and a vow made in good faith carried weight whether anyone remembered it or not, and this was fundamental to elven honor. And if they abandoned this principle for convenience, what separated them from species who valued nothing beyond immediate gain? Theron raised his hand for silence, and he announced that the Elder Circle would convene to hear arguments, and the proceedings would begin the following morning. And until then, the demolition was postponed, and Kira bowed respectfully and withdrew from the chamber, and she knew this was only the beginning. Outside the council building, Ash spread his wings and released a triumphant stream of fire into the sky. An ember circled Kira's legs protectively, and the elf woman felt the weight of what lay ahead, and she needed to prepare her case and gather evidence, and she had less than a day to compile centuries of human history into arguments that might move the immortal hearts of the Elder Circle. She returned to the memorial and began pulling data crystals and organizing materials, and she selected footage of human bravery and recordings of their art and testimonials from the few elves who had fought alongside humans, and she worked through the afternoon and into the evening, and Ash and Ember helped by using their perfect memory to recall specific incidents and moments. A visitor arrived as the twin suns began their descent, and Kira looked up to see Commander Drake standing in the doorway, and the elven military officer had served with her during the Krill Wars, and he had also fought beside humans, and his expression was conflicted. Drake explained that he supported what Kira was trying to do, and he remembered human courage, and he respected their sacrifice, but the council had made valid points, and the memorial occupied valuable land, and the galaxy had moved forward, and sometimes honoring the past meant accepting that things change. Kira asked Drake if he remembered the Battle of Crimson Valley, and his face darkened at the memory, and she reminded him how his unit was surrounded by Krill forces, and ammunition was gone, and defeat was certain. And then human reinforcements arrived, and Captain Beth Morrison led a desperate charge that broke the Krill line, and half her soldiers died in that assault. But they saved every elven warrior. Drake nodded slowly, and Kira pressed forward, and she asked if Captain Morrison's sacrifice meant less, because humanity eventually left the sector, and did the lives saved lose value, because the saviors were no longer around to accept gratitude. And Drake had no answer, and he departed, looking troubled. Night fell, and Kira continued her preparation, and she reviewed holographic footage of the Battle of the Shattered Moon, and it was the defining moment when humanity proved their worth, and the Krill had assembled their largest fleet, and they brought world-killer weapons capable of cracking planets, and Valdris Prime was the target. The Elven Defense Fleet engaged the Krill Armada, and the battle went poorly from the start, and Krill ships outnumbered defenders 3-1, and their hive tactics overwhelmed individual Elven vessels, and within 2 hours the defensive perimeter collapsed and evacuation of the surface began, and 15 billion Elven lives hung in the balance. Then Admiral Lisa Chen arrived with the human fleet, and it was only 12 ships, and they were already damaged from previous engagements, and their hulls showed scorch marks and makeshift repairs, and by every military calculation, they should have retreated and preserved their forces for future battles. Admiral Chen transmitted to the Elven command, and her message was simple and direct, and she said humans would buy time for the evacuation, and she ordered her ships forward, and Kira, who was coordinating ground defenses, watched in disbelief as those 12 vessels charged into the krill swarm. The humans fought with creativity born of desperation, and they used unconventional tactics that confused the hive-minded enemy. And Captain Jennifer Hayes rammed her destroyer into a krill carrier, and the explosion crippled 3 more enemy ships, and Commander Rebecca Stone detonated her ship's reactor while deep inside a krill formation, and the blast wave disrupted their coordination. One by one the human ships fell, and their crews fought to the last, and the Valiant Heart was Admiral Chen's flagship, and it limped forward with engines failing and atmosphere venting and a massive hole in its port side, and Amy Rodriguez was serving as tactical officer, and Kira had opened a private channel to her friend. Amy's face appeared on screen, and she was covered in burns and blood, ran from a cut above her eye, and fires burned behind her, and half the bridge crew was dead. But Amy was smiling, and she told Kira that they had one more trick, and the Valiant Heart was going to ram the Krill World killer. Kira begged her to eject, and the Elven recovery teams could retrieve escape pods, but Amy shook her head, and she explained that the ship needed someone to pilot it for maximum impact, and someone had to stay, and she looked directly at Kira and said she needed a favor. Amy asked Kira to promise something, and her voice was steady despite the chaos, and she said that someday humanity might be gone, and their sun would die, and the colony ships might not survive, and if that happened, she wanted Kira to remember and to tell their stories and to make sure the galaxy knew that humans existed and mattered. Kira promised through tears, and Amy nodded once and said that was all she needed, and then she smiled wider and said, "It was an honor fighting beside elves," and she cut the transmission, and 30 seconds later the Valiant Heart struck the Krill World Killer at full impulse. The explosion was visible from the surface, and it consumed the World Killer and half the Krill fleet, and the shockwave disrupted their formation, and the remaining Krill forces retreated, and Valdris Prime was saved, and 15 billion elves lived, because 12 human ships chose sacrifice over survival. Kira sat in the dark archive room and watched the footage again, and tears ran down her face as they had 300 years ago, and she understood what Amy had asked of her. And it was not just about maintaining a memorial, and it was about ensuring that sacrifice meant something, and that courage was not forgotten. Simply because the courageous were gone, Ash and Ember pressed close, and their warmth comforted her, and the dragons understood loss, and they had seen civilizations rise and fall, and they knew that memory was how the dead continued to matter. And Kira gathered her materials and prepared for tomorrow, and she would present her case, and she would honor her promise, and the Elder Circle would decide if Elven honor still meant anything. The Elder Circle convened in the ancient hall, and the chamber predated Silverspire City itself, and its walls were carved from living stone that remembered the first days of Elven civilization, and 7 elders sat in a semicircle, and they were the oldest living elves, and their combined age exceeded 15,000 years, and their judgment was considered absolute. High Counselor Theron presented the council's position first, and he spoke with measured calm, and he explained that the memorial occupied 50 acres of prime land in a growing city, and the human species had departed 3 centuries ago, and while their service was appreciated, maintaining such an extensive monument was impractical, and the land could house 3,000 elven families or serve as expanded agricultural zones. Theron continued, and he noted that Kira had spent her entire personal fortune on the memorial, and she had neglected her duties as a warrior and an instructor, and her obsession with the past prevented her from contributing to the present, and other species had come and gone throughout galactic history, and the elves did not maintain monuments for all of them. Counselor Mira added supporting testimony, and she argued that humans had made their own choice to leave, and they refused offers to integrate more fully into Elven society, and they had departed in their colony ships seeking independence, and if they valued their relationship with elves, they would have stayed, and they're leaving. proved the memorial was misplaced sentimentality. The Elder Circle listened without expression, and their ancient faces revealed nothing. And when Theron finished, the eldest among them, Elder Shayla, gestured for Kira to present her arguments, and the elf woman stood, and Ash and Ember remained at the entrance, and their presence a reminder of beings who understood the weight of memory. Kira began by activating a holographic display, and she showed footage of the Battle of the Shattered Moon, and the Elder Circle watched as human ships charged into impossible odds, and the hologram showed the valiant heart, making its final run, and the explosion that saved Valdris Prime. And Elder Shayla raised her hand and said they remembered this battle, and they acknowledged human bravery. But bravery alone did not justify permanent land allocation. Kira nodded, and she shifted her presentation, and she explained that this was not merely about bravery, and it was about a promise made in good faith. And throughout Elven history, the sanctity of oaths had been paramount, and she displayed ancient texts showing how Elven culture was built on the principle that promises transcended convenience and circumstance. She told them about Amy Rodriguez, and how in her final moments Amy had asked only that humans be remembered, and Kira had given her word, and that promise was witnessed by the dying embers of a destroyed fleet and the saved lives of billions, and to break such a promise would be to declare that Elven oaths had expiration dates. Elder Torin leaned forward, and he asked what made this promise different from countless other personal commitments. And elves made promises frequently, and not all of them required monuments. And Kira acknowledged this was true, but she argued there was a distinction between ordinary promises and sacred oaths, given in extraordinary circumstances. She showed them more footage, and it displayed moments of human interaction with elves. And there were human teachers instructing Elven children in mathematics, and human engineers helping repair Elven infrastructure, and human doctors treating wounded Elven soldiers. And she demonstrated that humans had integrated themselves into Elven society, and they had become partners rather than guests. Kira presented testimony from Commander Drake, and though he was conflicted, his words carried weight, and he described how human reinforcements had saved his unit at Crimson Valley, and he testified that Captain Beth Morrison had personally pulled him from a burning transport, and she died from injuries sustained in that rescue, and without her, Drake would not exist to provide this testimony. More testimonies followed, and Kira had collected statements from hundreds of elves who had known humans, and an agricultural supervisor described how human farming techniques had increased crop yields by 40%, and a teacher explained how human literature had enriched Elven understanding of mortality and perspective. And a mother testified that a human medic had saved her daughter's life using a procedure Elven doctors had not attempted. Elder Shayla asked about the humans' departure, and she wanted to know if the species had been forced to leave, or if they chose to go, and Kira answered honestly, and she explained that humans left because their sun was dying, and Earth would become uninhabitable, and the colony ships were their only hope for species survival, and they had invited elves to join them. But Elven counselors declined, believing the journey too dangerous. Theron interjected, and he argued this proved his point, and humans had made their choice, and they prioritized survival over maintaining their presence in Elven space, and Kira countered by asking what choice really existed, and the humans could stay and watch their homeworld die, or they could attempt the impossible and search for a new home, and calling that a choice was like calling suffocation, and drowning a choice. The Elder Circle conferred quietly among themselves, and Elder Marcus asked about the current state of humanity, and he wanted to know if the colony ships survived, and Kira felt her throat tighten, and she admitted she did not know. And long-range sensors had lost contact with the human vessels 250 years ago, and their trajectory took them beyond explored space, and survival was uncertain at best. Silence filled the ancient hall, and the weight of those words settled over everyone, and Elder Shayla asked why Kira continued maintaining the memorial if humanity might be extinct, and what purpose did the monument serve if there were no humans left to appreciate it. Kira straightened, and her voice carried clearly, and she said, "The memorial was not for humans, and it was for elves, and it stood as a reminder of what her people valued. And throughout history, elves prided themselves on honor and integrity and keeping their word. And if they dismantled the memorial, they declared that promises only mattered when convenient, and relationships only had value while both parties were present. She activated another hologram, and it showed human children playing in the settlement and their laughter echoing through streets. And she showed human artists creating sculptures and human musicians performing concerts. And she showed ordinary moments of a species living fully, despite knowing their time was brief. Kira explained that humans understood something elves often forgot, and mortality gave life urgency, and humans created art knowing it would outlast them. And they built monuments to people they never met, and they told stories across generations, and they loved fiercely because they knew love was finite. And the memorial honored not just human sacrifice, but the lesson humans taught about living with purpose. Elder Torin asked about practical considerations, and maintaining the memorial required resources and staff, and ongoing funding, and who would sustain it after Kira eventually passed and elves lived long but not forever. And Kira revealed she had established a trust, and the memorial had independent funding for the next 2,000 years. And she had trained Ash and Ember to serve as guardians, and dragons lived 5,000 years or more, and they remembered everything and they would ensure the stories survived. Counselor Mira objected, and she argued that binding dragons to maintain a memorial was excessive, and dragons should not be tasked with preserving memories of extinct species, and Ember responded before Kira could speak, and the dragon projected images directly into the minds of everyone present. The images showed ancient civilizations that dragons had witnessed, and there were species long gone and cultures that had risen and fallen, and Ember demonstrated that dragons already served as memory keepers, and they remembered everything they witnessed, and forgetting was not in their nature, and the human memorial was simply one more story in their vast collection. Elder Shayla called for final statements, and Theron stood, and he acknowledged that human sacrifice deserved recognition, but he maintained that the current memorial was excessive, and a smaller monument would suffice, and the land could serve multiple purposes, and surely compromise was possible. Kira gave her final argument, and she spoke from her heart, and she said that Amy Rodriguez had faced death without fear, and in her last moments, she thought, not of herself, but of ensuring her people would be remembered, and that level of selflessness deserved more than a plaque, and it deserved a testament to the idea that some things mattered more than convenience or profit or practical considerations. She looked at each elder in turn, and she reminded them that elven civilization was built on principles and honor and integrity, and the sanctity of promises, and if they abandoned those principles to reclaim land, they admitted that elven culture valued property over character. And the memorial stood not as a monument to humans but as a measure of elven souls. The elder circle deliberated, and the chamber fell silent, and Kira stood motionless, and Ash and Ember waited at the entrance. And minutes stretched into an hour, and finally Elder Shayla announced they had reached a decision, and her ancient eyes fixed on Kira, and the elf woman prepared herself for whatever judgment came. The memorial stood protected now, and visitors began arriving in greater numbers, and young elves came to learn about humans, and their teachers brought students to walk through the gardens and read the names carved in stone in the archive room, filled with researchers studying human culture and art. And Kira found herself conducting tours and sharing stories and answering questions about the species that had burned so briefly, but so brightly. 3 months passed after the Elder Circle. Judgment and Kira established a routine, and she opened the memorial at dawn and tended the gardens and maintained the archives. And each evening she stood before the wall of remembrance and spoke the names of the fallen. And it was a ritual Amy had told her about, and humans called it honoring the dead, and Kira found meaning in the practice. Ash and Ember had fully embraced their roles as guardians, and the dragons patrolled the grounds and greeted visitors, and they shared memories through mental projection, and young elves loved riding on Ember's back while Ash told stories through images, and the dragons made history tangible and real. One morning a messenger arrived with unusual news, and long-range sensors had detected multiple ships entering the system, and the vessels were broadcasting old human identification codes, and they were requesting permission to approach Valdris Prime, and the council was convening an emergency session, and Kira was summoned immediately. She arrived at the council chamber, and her heart raced with possibilities, and Theron stood at the central display, examining sensor data, and the ships numbered 37, and their design was unlike anything in current databases, and they appeared cobbled, together from multiple technologies, and their hulls showed signs of extensive repair and modification. Theron ordered Kira to establish communication, and she moved to the console and opened a channel, and static filled the speakers for several moments, and then a voice crackled through, and it was speaking standard Galactic with a strong human accent, and the speaker identified herself as Captain Helen Morrison of the Wanderer Fleet. Kira gripped the console edge, and her hands trembled, and she responded, asking if Captain Morrison was related to Beth Morrison. And there was a pause, and Helen confirmed that Beth was her great-great-grandmother, and the Wanderer fleet represented the survivors of the human colony ships, and they had spent 3 centuries crossing dark space, and they were searching for their ancestral home. The council chamber erupted in conversation, and Theron called for silence, and he asked Helen Morrison to explain how they found Valdris Prime and the human captain, explained that they had been following broadcasts and someone had been transmitting human stories and historical records, and those signals had served as a beacon guiding them across the void. Kira realized with shock that her memorial broadcasts had reached farther than she imagined, and she had been transmitting archived materials for educational purposes, and the signals had traveled through space for decades, and somehow the human colony ships had detected them and used them to navigate. Theron authorized the fleet to approach, and within hours the ships entered orbit, and they were magnificent in their ugliness, and each vessel told a story of survival, and Kira could see where different technologies had been integrated, and hull sections showed repair work from a dozen different species, and these ships had traveled farther and longer than any human vessel was designed to endure. The first shuttle landed at the memorial site, and Kira waited with Ash and Ember, and her heart pounded as the hatch opened and humans emerged, and they looked different than she remembered, and their features showed genetic drift and 3 centuries of adaptation, and they wore clothing styles that blended human tradition with alien influences. Captain Helen Morrison stepped forward, and she was tall and lean, and her dark hair was braided in intricate patterns, and she carried a worn leather case, and she approached Kira with tears in her eyes and said they had been searching for 300 years, and the memorial broadcast had given them hope when all seemed lost. Helen explained that the colony ships had survived but barely, and they had encountered hostile species and dangerous phenomena, and they had lost ships and people, and there were times when leadership debated whether to continue or find any habitable world and settle, and the memorial broadcasts reminded them of their heritage and gave them reason to push forward. She opened the leather case and pulled out a flight patch, and it was burned and faded, and it bore the insignia of the Valiant Heart. And Helen said it had belonged to Amy Rodriguez, and the patch was a family heirloom passed down through generations, and her great-great-grandmother had told stories about an elf warrior who fought beside humans and who promised to remember. Kira took the patch with shaking hands, and she pressed it against her heart, and emotions overwhelmed her, and 300 years of maintaining the memorial and fighting for recognition and honoring a promise made to a dying friend suddenly crystallized into this moment. And the humans had come home. More shuttles landed, and humans poured out, and they brought children and elders, and they carried mementos and photographs and data archives, and they were here to honor their ancestors and to see the memorial that had guided them across the darkness, and families gathered before the wall of remembrance, searching for names and touching the carved stone with reverence. Helen Morrison walked with Kira through the gardens, and she explained that the Wanderer fleet now numbered 40,000 humans, and they had been born in space and had never known a planet as home, and they were requesting permission to settle in the system and rebuild, and they understood if elves were hesitant given history, but they hoped their ancestors' sacrifice had earned consideration. Kira assured her that the council would grant permission, and the Elder Circle judgment had changed perspectives, and elves now understood that honoring the past meant welcoming the future. And besides, she had spent 3 centuries maintaining this memorial, and she refused to let it remain only a monument when it could become a bridge. The celebration lasted 3 days, and humans and elves gathered at the memorial sharing stories and comparing histories, and young humans met young elves, and they discovered common interests despite centuries of separation, and Ash and Ember delighted everyone by projecting memories of old Earth and showing images that even current humans had never seen. On the 3rd evening, Kira stood with Helen Morrison watching the twin suns set, and the human captain asked how Kira had maintained hope during 3 centuries of solitude and uncertainty, and Kira explained that promises were not contingent on outcomes, and she had given her word to Amy Rodriguez, and that oath existed independent of whether humans survived or returned. Helen smiled, and she said that Amy had chosen her friend well, and the Wanderer fleet carried extensive archives, and they had records of the Battle of the Shattered Moon, and every child learned about Admiral Lisa Chen and Captain Beth Morrison and Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez and the humans who had stayed behind to save elven lives. She revealed that the Wanderer fleet had encountered other species during their journey, and they had shared human stories, and several civilizations now told tales of the species that had fought beside elves, and the memorial broadcast had spread farther than anyone realized, and humanity was becoming legend across multiple sectors. Kira felt pride and sadness intermingling, and she thought about Amy Rodriguez, who had died, believing her species might be forgotten, and instead, human courage had inspired countless beings, and the memorial that nearly was demolished had become a beacon that guided survivors home and transformed tragedy into hope. The council met to discuss permanent settlement, and Theron proposed that humans be granted full citizenship and equal representation, and they would integrate into elven society while maintaining their cultural identity. And the vote was unanimous, and 3 centuries after, humans first arrived as refugees. They were welcomed as partners. Construction began immediately, and humans and elves worked together, designing a new district that blended both architectural styles and human engineers. Shared technologies developed during their journey, and elven scientists offered medical advances and agricultural techniques, and both species discovered they had much to learn from each other. The memorial expanded to include a section honoring the Wanderer fleet, and Kira worked with human historians documenting their 3-century journey and the stories of survival and perseverance and adaptation. And Ash and Ember added these memories to their vast collection, ensuring that future generations would understand the complete narrative. Helen Morrison remained on Valdris Prime, and she took a position as cultural liaison, and she helped translate human customs for elven audiences, and she worked closely with Kira, establishing educational programs and exchange initiatives, and a genuine friendship developed between them, and Kira saw echoes of Amy and Helen's determination and integrity one evening. Helen asked Kira about the promise, and she wanted to know if Kira felt relieved now that humans had returned and the memorial was vindicated, and Kira considered the question carefully, and she explained that the promise had never been about vindication, and it was about maintaining integrity and honoring friendship, and the human return was wonderful, but the memorial had already served its purpose. 5 years passed since the Wanderer fleet arrived, and Valdris Prime transformed into something neither humans nor elves had anticipated, and the new integrated district sprawled across 200 acres, and buildings combined elven crystalline architecture with human functional design, and children of both species played together in parks and schools. Taught combined curricula, and marriages between humans and elves occurred regularly. Despite the biological challenges, Kira walked through the memorial gardens, and she was no longer the sole caretaker, and a full staff maintained the grounds, and human volunteers worked alongside elven historians. And the archive had expanded to include thousands of new entries, and the Wanderer fleet had brought 3 centuries of additional human history, and the collection now represented the complete story of humanity's journey from Earth through the stars and back home. Helen Morrison had become more than a colleague, and she was Kira's closest friend. And they met every morning at the memorial entrance, and together they planned exhibits and educational programs and cultural exchanges, and their friendship mirrored the bond between Kira and Amy Rodriguez. And history had come full circle. The memorial now served multiple purposes, and it remained a place of remembrance, but it also functioned as a cultural center and community gathering space, and humans celebrated their holidays there, and elves held ceremonies, and both species used the grounds for weddings and festivals, and the Wall of Remembrance became a place where the living honored not just the dead, but the connections that transcended mortality. Ash and Ember had grown even larger, and their scales shimmered with age and wisdom, and they spent their days sharing memories with visitors, and young dragons from other regions came to learn from them. And the memorial became a training ground for dragon memory keepers, and Kira's bonded companions ensured that their methods would continue for thousands of years. One afternoon, Kira received a message from the Galactic Council, and representatives from 17 species requested permission to visit the memorial, and they had heard stories about the elf who kept a 3-century promise and the humans who crossed the void, guided by broadcasts of their own history, and they wanted to understand what made this relationship unique. Theron accompanied the delegation, and he had become one of the memorial's strongest advocates, and the High Counselor who once wanted it demolished now spoke passionately about its importance, and he told visitors that the memorial represented more than human-elven relations, and it demonstrated principles that all civilizations should embrace. The delegation walked through the exhibits, and they watched holographic footage of human battles and human art and human daily life, and they read testimonials from elves whose lives were changed by human interaction, and they stood before the wall of remembrance contemplating names of beings they never knew, and several delegates wept openly, and the memorial affected them deeply. A Centauri ambassador asked Kira why she maintained the promise when humans disappeared, and logic suggested they were extinct, and Kira explained that promises were not calculations, and they were commitments of character, and abandoning a promise, because it became difficult, meant the promise never really existed, and honor required consistency, especially when no one was watching. A Draknari representative wanted to know what made humans worthy of such devotion, and Kira smiled, and she activated a hologram showing Amy Rodriguez's final moments, and she let the footage speak for itself, and the delegates watched as Amy chose certain death to save billions of elves, and the Draknari representative bowed deeply and said his species would establish their own memorial to honor human sacrifice. The visit sparked a movement, and within months, 17 species announced plans to create monuments honoring human courage, and several civilizations incorporated human stories into their educational systems, and children, across multiple sectors, learned about the species that had lived briefly, but mattered greatly, and humanity became a symbol of selfless heroism. Helen Morrison coordinated with these initiatives, and she traveled to different worlds, sharing historical archives, and helping design exhibits. And she discovered that human culture resonated with many species, and the emphasis on art and storytelling and making meaning from finite existence appealed to beings who also faced mortality. Meanwhile, human scientists made breakthroughs in agricultural technology, and they developed techniques for growing crops in harsh environments, and their 3-century journey through space had forced innovation, and elven farmers adopted these methods, and food production increased dramatically, and famine became a distant memory. In regions that had struggled, human engineers revolutionized transportation, and their experience maintaining colony ships with limited resources taught them efficiency, and they designed vessels that required less fuel and easier maintenance, and elven shipyards incorporated human innovations, and galactic trade expanded because shipping costs decreased. But the greatest contribution was philosophical, and humans reminded elves what purpose felt like, and immortal beings could postpone decisions indefinitely, and elves often delayed actions believing they had unlimited time, and humans demonstrated that urgency created meaning and finite existence. Forced prioritization, and elven society began embracing more decisive action. Kira noticed changes in younger elves, and they approached life differently than previous generations, and they pursued passions immediately, rather than waiting centuries, and they formed deeper relationships, because human friends taught them that connection required vulnerability, and impermanence made moments precious. A human philosopher named Karen Brooks published a treatise comparing elven and human perspectives, and she argued that immortality and mortality were not opposites but complementary, and elves provided stability and long-term vision, and humans offered urgency and intensity, and together, both species achieved balance that neither could accomplish alone. The treatise became required reading in schools, and it sparked debates about the nature of time and meaning and value, and elven philosophers engaged with human thinkers, and they developed new frameworks for understanding existence and collaboration, produced insights that single-species analysis never could. The memorial hosted conferences where scholars from multiple species gathered to discuss these ideas, and Kira found herself at the center of philosophical movements. And she never sought such prominence, and she had simply kept a promise, but that promise had catalyzed transformation, and sometimes small acts of integrity created ripples that changed everything. Theron approached Kira one evening, and he thanked her for her stubbornness, and he admitted he had been wrong, and the memorial was never about land or resources, and it was about identity and principles and who elves chose to be. And by protecting the memorial, the Elder Circle had protected Elven soul. He revealed that enrollment in military service had increased since humans returned, and young elves wanted to serve with honor, and they cited stories of human sacrifice as inspiration. And the memorial had revitalized concepts of duty and courage that had grown stale over centuries, and Elven culture was experiencing a renaissance. Kira felt humbled by these revelations, and she had never imagined such outcomes, and she had simply wanted to honor a friend and keep her word. And the fact that her actions inspired broader change was unexpected, and she deflected praise by insisting the credit belonged to Amy Rodriguez and all the humans who chose sacrifice over self-preservation. Helen Morrison disagreed, and she told Kira that humans could be brave, but bravery meant nothing without witness, and Amy Rodriguez's sacrifice would have been forgotten if not for Kira's dedication, and the memorial ensured that courage had lasting impact. And that was the true gift, and not the remembering, but the refusal to let memory die. They stood together watching children play and human. Kids chased Elven kids through the gardens, and they laughed in the universal language of youth, and Ash and Ember watched over them protectively, and the dragons projected gentle images of flowers and butterflies to delight the children. Kira thought about Amy Rodriguez, and she wondered if her friend could see what her sacrifice had created, and a simple promise made in desperation had become a foundation for unprecedented cooperation, and human-elven partnership was changing galactic society, and other species were adopting similar collaborative models. She touched the flight patch that Helen had given her, and Kira wore it always, and the burned fabric reminded her why she persevered through 3 centuries of doubt and loneliness and criticism, and the patch represented more than one woman, and it symbolized the principle that some things mattered more than comfort or convenience. A young human girl approached, and she asked Kira if the stories were true, and did dragons really remember everything? And Kira smiled and called Ember over, and the dragon lowered her massive head, and the girl reached out tentatively and touched Ember's scales. Ember projected images into the girl's mind, and she showed ancient Earth and cities that humans built, and forests that no longer existed. And the girl gasped in wonder, and she could see her ancestors' homeworld. And Ember shared memories of Amy Rodriguez and Admiral Lisa Chen and Captain Beth Morrison and all the humans who had fought and died to save Elven lives.